All right, everyone. Tonight we're starting with something a bit more somber, a time marked by disease, hardship, and gruel. We're going back to the Middle Ages to uncover what life was really like. Forget the romanticized tales of knights and grand castles. In reality, you probably wouldn't last a single day. Before settling in, feel free to support if you genuinely enjoy this kind of content. And drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some ambient background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey. You've just opened your eyes in the year 1325. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the fleas. Your bed is a straw-filled mattress, half rotten and full of bugs, set on what used to be a barn floor. There are no soft sheets or memory foam, just a wool blanket that hasn't been cleaned in a year and now weighs as much as livestock from accumulated dirt. You wake to the clanging of a distant church bell, the medieval version of an alarm clock, only more jarring. Your home is a one-room wooden hut with no windows and an open layout shared with your family, a few animals, and a lot of insects. The smell is an overpowering mix of stale ale, sweat, livestock, and an ominous mouldy scent. No candles, no air fresheners, just you and the raw scent of survival. You try to stretch, but it's cold and your joints protest. You're 22, which by the standards of the time is middle-aged. Your body creaks like an old door, and standing up means stepping onto a floor that's either wet from a leaking roof or crusted with unmentionables courtesy of the neighbor's chicken. There's no privacy, your entire family, and maybe a random cousin or two wake up beside you. No curtains, no personal space, just shared everything. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never really alone thanks to the company of parasites, rodents, and several other humans. And that's just the beginning. You've made it out of your makeshift bed, well done. Now nature calls loudly. Here's where the modern bathroom is sorely missed. There's no toilet, no paper, no plumbing. For most peasants, the bathroom is a wooden bucket behind their house, and it's already occupied thanks to a relative's unfortunate encounter with some questionable turnips. The smell is overwhelming. You do your business and then, as custom dictates, throw it into the street, yelling a warning which few heed. The streets double as sewers filled with waste of all kinds. If you're in a town with public latrines, you'll sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in poorly ventilated outhouses. Privacy? Non-existent. Toilet paper? Not a thing. People make do with straw, moss, rags, or occasionally wool. Sometimes nothing at all. And if you're in a castle, you might have a simple hole in the wall leading to the moat. Convenient, except it's also a potential entry point for enemies. No matter your status, using the bathroom is cold, communal, dangerous, and utterly unpleasant. One misstep and you're face down in waste. And you haven't even brushed your teeth yet, but we'll get to that. You survived the worst part of the morning, now maybe a hot breakfast. Not likely. This is medieval Europe. Nothing is cozy here. Breakfast is meager. No gourmet dishes or comforting drinks, just a wooden bowl of, it looks like something scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily serving of pottage. Pottage is a thick, gloopy stew made from whatever's available, grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering for days, sometimes weeks, with new ingredients just dumped on top. It's less a recipe and more of an ongoing food experiment. Alongside it, a chunk of bread so hard it could stop an arrow. made from coarse rye or barley, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or whatever else they can find, because wheat is for the wealthy. This loaf isn't something you slice, it's something you wrestle with. And drinks? Don't expect orange juice or coffee. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer at 6 a.m. Why? Because the water is full of parasites and filth. So you start your day with weak ale, low alcohol, high survival value. Even kids drink it. No one likes it, but at least it won't kill you right away. Want meat or cheese? Forget it. That's for special occasions, and only if your Lord is feeling generous. Most people eat meat only a handful of times a year. Fresh fruit is a rare treat, and only if it's in season and hasn't already turned into wine. As for spices, they're reserved for royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than your entire monthly wage. Salt is so valuable it's locked away. So you eat your gritty bread, gulp down your medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that might have nibbled your stew last night. Breakfast doesn't energize you, it just happens. And now that you're underfed, it's time to work, because your life depends on it. Now that you've eaten your depressing medieval breakfast, it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help. Your wardrobe consists of one outfit, a rough wool tunic or linen shift, which you've worn every day, for months, maybe years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. You wear it until it falls apart, or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear is optional. If you're lucky, there's a linen undertunic. If you're not, you're going commando under scratchy, sweaty wool, all sewn together by someone who probably didn't know what a proper seam looked like. There's no washing machine, no soap, and no dry cleaner. Your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a compost pile marinated in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, you'd have to haul water from the river, or heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board with ashes, and hope the sun shines for the 3 days a year it's out. And don't even get me started on shoes. If you have any, they're made from untreated leather, barely stitched, and offer as much support as a banana peel. Most people just go barefoot, trudging through mud, dung, and sharp rocks. This all leads to one simple conclusion. Your skin hates you. You're constantly itching. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs are your constant companions. Nobles, monks, children, they all suffer. No one escapes. You'll be scratching yourself with a wooden spoon while talking to the local priest, and no one will bat an eye. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing. Your scalp is covered in bites, and if you develop a rash, tough luck. There's no dermatologist, no ointment, nothing to ease the suffering. You just endure. If you're lucky enough to avoid infection, great. The rash will stick around for months, like an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now that you're dressed in misery, it's time to work yourself to exhaustion. But first, let's talk about smiling. Don't. In the Middle Ages, it's not an emotional risk, it's a dental one. There's no toothbrush, toothpaste, mouthwash, or floss. The idea of oral hygiene is as foreign as bathing. Some might chew on twigs or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are on their own and they're suffering. By your mid-20s, your smile resembles something from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums swollen. Those aren't food stains, that's decay. Sugar, while rare, is starting to become more common among the wealthy. Imported at great expense, mostly used in small cakes to flaunt their wealth. If you're a noble, congrats. You'll rot your teeth even faster than the peasants. If you're poor, you'll do it slowly over years of fermented bread, gritty porridge, and endless chewing. Toothaches? Get used to them. They're like the constant presence of medieval weather, always lurking in the background. The type of pain that makes you consider extreme measures like praying, drinking, or trying to pull the tooth out yourself with pliers. And no, that's not a joke. That was the real treatment back then. Dentists weren't around, but barber surgeons were. The same person who cut your hair might have also been the one pulling out your tooth by candlelight with an iron hook and no anesthesia. If you had an infected tooth, be ready for fevers. Without antibiotics, it could easily lead to sepsis, and a toothache could be deadly. The same thing that sends us to the pharmacy today could have been fatal centuries ago. And socially, things weren't much better. Kissing? Forget about it. Bad breath was common everywhere. If you were single, you weren't judged by your smile, but by your land and livestock. In short, your mouth was a battlefield, and it was losing. Now that your teeth are throbbing, let's head outside. The real work, the kind that will wear you down, is just beginning. There's no office, no desk, no coffee breaks, and no chance for advancement. For most people, the job is simple. Don't die while working to make someone else comfortable. You're a peasant. Congratulations. You work the land of a lord who likely doesn't even remember your name. You wake up with the sun and don't stop until it sets. Your tools are a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever parts of your body are still functioning. There's no weekend. You don't clock out. You work from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Sunday might be a break if you're not harvesting, fighting off raiders, or praying that your infected toe stops turning black. The work is grueling. Fields are ploughed by hand or with oxen, if you're fortunate enough to afford one. You dig ditches, plant seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine curves like an S. No one cares if you're exhausted, and no one checks on your mental state. If you're a woman, you don't just work the fields. You also take care of the kids, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and deal with your husband's lice infestation, slowly creeping to your side of the bed. Your side of the bed. Children start helping at age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a hope they won't die from the flu. If you're one of the few not working the land, you might be a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper, but it's no better. You're working with fire, chemicals, or animal parts all day in poorly ventilated spaces. The pay is just enough to survive. The perks include occasional injuries, break a bone, tough luck, get a fever, drink warm beer, and keep working. You can't afford to stop, because if you do, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, there's always someone ready to replace you. So you keep working, ignoring the blisters, because your job isn't a career, it's a long, grueling test of endurance. Now that your back aches from working the fields, let's talk about the weather. In the Middle Ages, temperatures weren't just seasonal, they were ongoing punishment from above. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, and no way to weather the cold. The walls are made of wood with gaps big enough to throw a chicken through. Your windows are covered with cloth, not glass. The hearth fire is a nice idea, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it burning because wood is expensive and gathering it might be illegal. Yes, you could be executed for picking the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your one damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying fire, and still wake up with a frozen nose. Your feet are perpetually cold and damp. Your fingers are stiff, feeling like tiny popsicles. Frostbite isn't a diagnosis, it's just bad luck. Now let's jump to summer. Sounds better? It's not. In summer, your home turns into a clay oven. There's no fan, no breeze, and definitely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers but can't take them off because exposing too much skin is scandalous, and it leads to sunburn, insect bites, and judgment. Flies swarm around your unwashed body, and the smell of leftover goat stew fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz around you while you try to sleep, assuming you can even sleep through the noise of neighbors shouting and babies crying. In the fields, the sun beats down relentlessly. No sunscreen, no hat, unless you've made one out of straw, like a desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke is just considered part of the job. So you're either freezing in your hovel, hoping your toes survive the winter, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks, suffering through chafing. And no matter the season, your clothes still itch, your food still... Conditions remain dreadful, and your next ordeal is already lined up. Welcome to pre-modern climate control, meaning there is none. Feeling parched? Want to rinse your face or shake off this damp, feverish existence? Too bad. In this era, water isn't an ally, it's a silent assassin. Let's start with drinking. That stream nearby looks pristine and inviting, like something out of a storybook. Spoiler? It isn't. Just upstream, someone may have emptied a chamber pot, or worse, a dead animal could be rotting in it. Each sip is a roll of the dice with parasites, bacteria, and the microbial legion of the era waiting to invade. That's why beer was the go-to beverage, even for kids. Not the boozy kind, but a diluted version that was more about staying alive than getting tipsy. Brewing involved boiling the water, making it safer than what flowed through the local waste trench. If you were wealthy, wine was an option, though it didn't pair well with productivity. As for bathing, while water could theoretically clean you, in practice, it was avoided. People believed washing opened pores, letting illness in. Hygiene meant keeping the grime on. Communal bathhouses existed, but were quickly associated with scandal, which led to many being shut down by religious authorities. Even if you were determined to wash, the process was exhaustive, hauling water from a well, heating it over fire, pouring it into a leaky wooden tub, and hoping no one else got to it first. Rainwater wasn't much help either. It collected bird droppings, insects, and algae. So whether for drinking, washing, or watering crops, water was more risk than resource. One contaminated gulp and you'd end up sweating in a straw bed, questioning every decision you made. Today, a sip from the faucet is simple. Back then, hydration came with hazards. Now let's talk medicine, if it can be called that. Something's wrong? Too bad. Diagnosis was based on the balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these in harmony, like some internal stew. Fever, that means too much blood. Solution, bloodletting, either with a blade or a leech. And yes, barbers often doubled as amateur surgeons. Feeling down or anxious? Clearly, you're full of black bile. Treatment involved purging with herbal remedies, maybe some prayer, and a community already preparing for your funeral. Break a bone or suffer a wound, you're in real trouble. No painkillers, no antiseptics. Instruments are more medieval torture than medical tools. Fire-heated, not for hygiene, but effect. Germ theory didn't exist. Illness was blamed on bad air or divine wrath. Stomachache? Must be moral failure. Time to confess while vomiting. If things got worse, they'd try more leeches, crushed insects, and call in a priest, just in case. If you somehow survived, credit went to divine mercy, the doctor, and maybe the leech. Treatment was often worse than the illness itself. After enduring a day of toil, pests, and primitive healthcare, it's time to eat, assuming you can. But don't get your hopes up. Food safety is laughable. No refrigeration, just salt, smoke, or cold weather. If meat's on the menu, it's likely been aging in open air, shared with pests and questionably preserved. Bread, the staple food, wasn't much safer. In poor harvest years, people stretched it with fillers like bark. Sawdust or clay might be added to stretch the food, and during rye season there's an extra surprise: urgot, a fungus causing seizures, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like consuming bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables are only available when in season, and the one that's always in season: turnips. You can find them boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, a hot, mysterious mix of ingredients simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit shows up in the fall, but it spoils quickly. Sugar, rare and costly, is hoarded by the rich, flaunting their rotten teeth. Dairy is a gamble. Fresh milk spoils fast, and while butter and cheese last longer, they're filled with bacteria. People eat them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or chew on boot leather. When it comes to seasoning, spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg are more precious than gold. For the average person, flavor comes from onions, a bit of salt if you're lucky, and the ever-present feeling of discomfort. Most meals taste like wet burlap, sprinkled with sorrow. But food isn't just a physical hazard, it's a political one. Game belongs to the Lord, not you. Get caught poaching a rabbit, and you could be fined, jailed, or even executed. Yes, your dinner could cost you your life. So, as you eat your grey stew by the fire, remember, each bite is a risk, but you eat it anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. It's evening now. You've worked hard, endured, and barely digested your questionable stew. You might think the day is over, but don't get too comfortable because God's watching. So are the priest and your neighbor Agnes, who will report you if you skip Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just a part of life, it is life. The church controls everything: your calendar, your laws, your education, your birth, your marriage, and your death. It's like a spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is organized around prayer times, with the church bell ringing at morning, noon, and night. Not to remind you, but to warn you, missing a prayer is a sin. Forget to bow. Sin. Eat meat on Friday. Sin. Dream of your neighbor's wife. Double sin. And hell, it's terrifyingly real. Fire rivers, boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and endless wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, the fear of eternal damnation certainly will. You can't read the Bible because it's in Latin, reserved for monks, priests, and the rare noble kid. You rely on the church to explain everything to you. If the priest says your crop failure is because you didn't pray enough, then it's time to pray harder. Tithes, 1/10 of everything you own, are mandatory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you have chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, you're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holidays are holy days, dozens of them. While they provide a break from labor, they're not for enjoyment. Attending Mass, fasting, confessing sins, and remembering that joy is dangerous are the priorities. Questioning the church, dangerous. Heretics are burned, witches drowned, blasphemers flogged, and skeptics quickly corrected. So you go through the motions. You chant, bow, and pray that your soul, after enduring this dirty life, will reach paradise if the priest favors you. Because in the Middle Ages, God might show mercy, but the church certainly won't. If being a medieval peasant was tough, try being a woman. The filth, famine, and fear are compounded by childbirth, subjugation, and invisibility. Being a woman back then is like playing the hardest mode with no healing potions or restart options. From birth, a girl's life path is sealed. Marry young, have children, serve her husband, and die exhausted. Education? Not likely. Unless you're noble and sent to a convent, your learning stops when you can churn butter and patch clothes. Marriage happens early, really early. Being betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14 is normal. It's not about love, it's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion? Not needed. Once married, you're essentially your husband's property. Your job is to bear children, feed everyone, run the household, and never complain. Complaining could get you labelled a nag, or worse, a witch. That label often comes with a drowning or burning, depending on the local trend. Childbirth is a deadly gamble. No prenatal care, no sterile instruments, and no anesthesia. Even minor complications can mean death for the mother, the baby, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies, but many don't. But don't worry, once the baby's born, your work doesn't stop. Now you have a crying infant in a lice-infested hut, and you still have to nurse, cook, clean, and help in the fields. No breaks for you. You are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable. If you're in the Middle Ages, women who didn't follow societal norms were often labelled as dangerous, especially if they had herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or simply appeared unusual. Even within the church, their roles were limited. Nuns lived under strict restrictions, no speaking without permission, no freedom to move, and their spiritual worth was always considered inferior to that of men. In essence, women were expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer silently, even in a time of widespread hardship, always doing so with grace. Despite the universal suffering, women were expected to bear their hardships with dignity. You faced filth, hunger, social injustice, and possibly even an angry goat, but just when you thought things couldn't get worse, there was the threat of violence. Violence was loud, bloody, and often seen as acceptable by the standards of the time. Law and order were loosely defined, with your fate depending mostly on the mood of your local lord. Violence pervaded every aspect of life, at home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church squabbles, and even in mundane situations like waiting at the communal oven. Crime was common, punishment severe, and justice was often a mere spectacle rather than protection. If you stole a loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. If you were accused of lying, your tongue could be pierced. Those who gossiped were subjected to the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to their head to silence them. In the case of serious accusations, heresy, theft, witchcraft, the way to prove your innocence was through torture. One method involved sticking your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If you were unharmed after 3 days, you were deemed innocent. If not, you were guilty. Another method had you tossed into a river. If you sank, you were innocent, but likely dead. If you floated, you were guilty and would be punished regardless. It was like a medieval game show where survival was the prize, and the odds were stacked against you. Executions were public events with crowds cheering as people were hanged, beheaded, or burned alive, sometimes accompanied by snacks. Domestic violence was common, with husbands having the right, and sometimes the obligation, to discipline their wives and children. Fights on the street were frequent, and you could be beaten for something as minor as looking at a noble's horse the wrong way. Wars, fueled by territorial disputes, feuds, and religious crusades, were a constant threat. Society was built on violence, and everyone lived with the awareness that life was fragile, justice arbitrary, and your neighbor might harm you over a petty dispute. Surviving the daily grind of lice, leeches, and brutal living conditions meant enduring a life that was short and uncertain. The average life expectancy was around 30 to 40 years, but this figure was skewed by high infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before they reached 5. Disease, malnutrition, or a bad winter could claim a life quickly. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already worn out by hard labor. By 25, your body was falling apart, missing teeth, fingers, and any youthful optimism. For women, childbirth was a deadly risk, often leading to death from blood loss or complications. Men faced their own dangers, such as farming accidents, infections from minor injuries, and violence from neighbors or war. Death could strike at any moment, whether from plague, famine, or sheer bad luck, like eating spoiled food. Even funerals were rushed. Bodies were buried quickly to prevent the spread of disease, often with no embalming or proper coffins, just a shallow grave and a few murmured prayers. In the end, medieval life was brutal, short, and always in the shadow of death. There was no retirement, only the eventual cessation of life. Now, how was your day? Avoid the plague and narrowly escape a public execution for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think again. The romanticized image of the Middle Ages, brave swordsmen, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles, and feasts in candlelit halls, is just a myth, polished by fairy tales and fantasy novels. In reality, the medieval world was harsh, brutal, and deeply unjust. Social rank ruled everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born wealthy, you had a better chance of surviving, but you were still only a step away from dying of a bad meal or an infected wound. Even the nobles weren't safe from hardship. Castles were cold stone fortresses filled with fleas, smoke, and politically arranged marriages. Sure, you might have a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in battle or from a small injury. Not exactly luxury. These so-called simpler times were far from simple. Life was relentless. Everything took longer, hurt more, and came with risks from childbirth to eating. Survival, not leisure, defined life. And if you did find a quiet moment to dream of something better, there wasn't much you could do about it. No social mobility, no modern medicine, and no internet to figure out that weird rash. People lived, suffered, worked, and died within a small radius of where they were born. But the wildest part, despite all this, people still laughed, sang, told stories, fell in love, and found meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn that way. Even in the darkest moments, they made room for joy. So tonight, when you settle into your clean bed with modern comforts like plumbing, antibiotics, and heating, maybe take a moment to appreciate the modern world and the ancestors who battled disease, hunger, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to. Before becoming Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, a reformist icon, and an ambitious ruler, she was simply Sophie. Born Sophie Federica Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she was the daughter of a minor German noble family. Her small duchy in Pomerania offered little influence. However, Sophie possessed something no title could offer: sharp intelligence, irresistible charm, and an intense drive for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and ambitious, more focused on social climbing than providing warmth. Her father, a Prussian officer, was more distant than disciplinary. From a young age, Sophie learned how to navigate between obedience and cunning. She devoured books, spoke multiple languages, and became an expert at reading a room, skills that would serve her well in one of Europe's most cutthroat courts. When Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna sought a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked outside of Russia. Peter was of German descent, and Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, grateful and easy to control, would be ideal. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. She had noble blood, a Lutheran faith she would soon abandon, and a reputation for grace and humility. At just 14, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in St. Petersburg in 1744, clad in thin German garments and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her into this new life like a pawn. Sophie, however, had her own plans. To integrate into Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and irreversible. Sophie wasn't just changing religions, she was severing all ties to her past, stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. No one could have predicted what would come next: betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. From the moment she set foot in the Russian court, Sophie ceased to be a pawn and began plotting how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was supposed to secure her place in Russian royalty, but from the start it felt more like a prison than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, wasn't the charming prince of fairy tales. Awkward, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he cared more about playing war games than ruling an empire or being affectionate to his wife. Some reports even suggest he avoided consummating the marriage for years. He admired Frederick the Great of Prussia and despised the Russian court that had taken him in. In contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with relentless determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted to escape. This mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a breeding ground for gossip, paranoia, and ruthless power struggles. Empress Elizabeth still held absolute power, but her health was deteriorating and a transition seemed imminent. Everyone had their own agenda. Catherine was constantly under surveillance. Her letters were read, her relationships scrutinized, and every move she made was watched. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who still manipulated her for foreign interests, or even her own servants. In this world, alliances were everything. Catherine quickly learned to navigate the political intrigue around her, quietly gaining allies in the shadows. She befriended military leaders, scholars, and earned a reputation for grace and self-control, in stark contrast to her husband's childish behavior and disdain for Russian traditions. Catherine began reading works by Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu, quietly developing her vision for a stronger, more educated, and rational Russia. While many saw her simply as a young wife, she was plotting a future for the nation. However, as long as Peter lived, Catherine remained in a powerless position, married to a ruler unfit for the throne. So, she observed and waited. Catherine knew the Russian throne wouldn't be passed down by inheritance. It would have to be claimed. In 1762, after years of planning, she saw her chance. When Peter III ascended to the throne following the death of Empress Elizabeth, his reign quickly began to unravel. In just a few months, Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and praised Russia's enemy, Prussia. He reversed policies, humiliated religious leaders, and even discussed divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. His erratic behavior turned the court against him, and the military, where many leaders supported Catherine, grew dissatisfied. The Russian public, deeply patriotic, viewed Peter as a foreign puppet, and his actions only strengthened their resentment. Seizing the moment, Catherine launched a bloodless coup in July of 1762. With the support of key military figures, including her lover, Gregory Olaf, and his brothers, she was declared Empress. Peter, caught off guard, surrendered within days and was soon found dead under mysterious circumstances, though the official cause was reported as a medical issue. Catherine had taken the throne not by birth or marriage, but through sheer will and strategy. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had ascended to the Russian throne without a single battle. Yet her real challenge had only begun. Catherine now faced the task of solidifying her power and turning her bold move into a lasting legacy. She needed to prove her worth to both the Russian people and the nobility. Could she hold the empire together and avoid the same fate as her husband? Catherine knew that power gained through manipulation could be easily lost, so she focused on ruling not through cunning, but as a visionary. Her reign would reshape Russia into a stronger, more enlightened empire. Rather than merely enjoying the power of the throne, Catherine aimed to transform Russia in every aspect, not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter admired Frederick the Great and military conquests, Catherine idolized Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot. She believed in reason, progress, education, and saw the monarch's role as a servant to the people, even if she ruled with absolute power. Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she embraced it. She corresponded with Voltaire for over 15 years while defending her autocratic rule, and invited Diderot to her court, even purchasing his entire library to support him. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts and worked on reforms to modernize Russia. One of her early initiatives was the creation of the Legislative Commission in 1767, a bold attempt to rewrite Russia's legal code. Catherine's instructions served as a political manifesto, advocating for equality before the law, the abolition of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the people. For a ruler in 18th century Russia, this was revolutionary. Yet Catherine understood the challenge of implementing such ideals in a vast, feudal, conservative country. While she advocated for reform, she moved cautiously. She reduced certain forms of torture, expanded secular education, and built schools and libraries, but also ensured that the nobility maintained control over their serfs, thus keeping them loyal. Catherine's balancing act between Enlightenment ideals and practical governance continued throughout her reign. She was a philosopher queen in public, but a pragmatic empress in private. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always carefully measured, blending ideology with survival. She was not looking to make Russia purely European, but rather to modernize it on her own terms, combining reform with firm control. Catherine's ambitions went beyond reforming Russia internally. She sought to expand Russia's influence and make it an empire that commanded respect and fear from other nations. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to tear down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's territory expanded like never before. She fought wars not just to protect her throne, but to reshape Europe's map. One of her most pivotal campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, which spanned the 1760s and 1770s, were about more than just land. They were about exerting influence. Catherine positioned herself as the savior of Orthodox Christians under Muslim control and as the rightful guardian of Eastern Europe. With the help of generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Pimpkin, Russia seized critical territories such as Crimea, the northern Black Sea coast, and gained access to warm water ports, a long-desired goal of Russian czars. These triumphs weren't just military but symbolic. Each victory communicated that Russia was no longer the distant, backward nation of Europe. It had become a continental powerhouse. She also turned her attention to the West. Through a series of diplomatic strategies, Catherine helped orchestrate the partitions of Poland, dividing the faltering Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with Austria and Prussia. By the time the third partition occurred in 1795, Poland was wiped off the map, and Russia gained vast new territories and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just expand with armies, she also expanded through ideas. New cities sprang up, trade routes were developed, and German settlers were brought in to cultivate Russian lands. The empire transformed into a diverse expanse, stretching from the frozen Baltic to the sun-drenched Black Sea. Through it all, Catherine remained the central figure, overseeing reports, issuing directives, and controlling the shape of her growing empire. Critics accused her of being power-hungry and imperialistic, but to Catherine, expansion wasn't about ambition, it was her destiny. She believed a great ruler's worth wasn't just in ideas, but in the extent of their territory. She didn't just want to rule Russia, she aimed to make it a civilized empire that was feared by enemies, respected by peers, and loyal only to her. Along with her brilliance and authority, Catherine was also famous for her private life, which became one of the most discussed aspects of her reign. She had many lovers, carefully selected, often younger, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide these relationships. In fact, she rewarded her lovers with titles, estates, and pensions for their loyalty. Those who displeased her were discreetly dismissed. Among her most notable lovers was Gregory Pimpkin, a man of great intellect and boldness. Their relationship went beyond romance. It blurred the lines between love, politics, and partnership. Some believe they may have even secretly married. Together, they influenced military strategies, colonization efforts, and the development of southern Russia. However, Europe couldn't overlook the scandal. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, and even unstable. After her death, these rumors worsened, including the infamous false story about her and a horse, which was spread by her enemies to tarnish her legacy. Why the obsession? Simply put, Catherine wielded power without apology. In an era when female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to fit either mold. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, which made her a threat. Ironically, while her critics condemned her for immorality, Catherine herself took a philosophical view of love and sexuality. She believed that pleasure was a natural part of life and that personal relationships didn't interfere with public duty. She was able to separate emotion from governance, something few male rulers managed. In truth, her relationships were often political, as she surrounded herself with loyal, capable, and useful men. When they ceased to be so, she let them go, usually with a generous retirement package. Catherine's romantic life didn't undermine her rule. It was part of her strategy, a mix of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. Despite her strength, Catherine's reign wasn't without its dangers. In 1773, she faced a major threat in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He wasn't just any rebel. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, her late husband, insisting he had survived the coup and returned to reclaim the throne from the foreign empress. Though the claim was absurd, Peter had long since died. It didn't need to be true for the oppressed lower classes of Russia. It simply needed to give them hope. Pugachev promised freedom, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words ignited a revolt across the Volga River region, particularly among the Cossack peasants and old believers. At a time when the divide between nobles and serfs had become brutal, his promises seemed like salvation. The Pugachev rebellion grew into the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were overtaken, fortresses fell, and nobles were killed. For a moment it seemed like the empire might collapse. Catherine was rattled. This wasn't a foreign war that could be won with cavalry and treaties. This was an insurrection from within her own people. The system was under her control. She governed with authority. Yet Catherine did not falter in the face of adversity. She took decisive action, sending military forces to quash the uprising with brutal efficiency. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774, and he was captured, placed in an iron cage, and later executed in Moscow as a public example for anyone who might consider following in his footsteps. Afterward, Catherine focused even more on maintaining strict order. Her initial aspirations to free the serfs faded quietly, overshadowed by the reality that her vision of enlightenment clashed with the feudal constraints of the country. She increasingly relied on the nobility, who pledged loyalty in exchange for total control over their serfs. This marked a shift. The Empress, once an admirer of Enlightenment ideas, now prioritized stability over philosophical ideals. Reforms became more cautious, surveillance intensified, and even the slightest whisper of rebellion was swiftly crushed. While Pugachev lost his life, his revolt left an indelible warning for Catherine that power based on inequality would eventually lead to upheaval. By the time Catherine entered her later years, she had ruled for over 30 years, longer than any woman before her in Russian history. From her rise to power, she defied expectations, transformed her empire, and redefined the role of both women and monarchs. During her reign, Russia became a formidable European power. Its territory grew by more than 200,000 square miles, acquiring Crimea, parts of Poland, and sections of the Black Sea coast. These gains were not mere military victories. They were strategic maneuvers that secured crucial warm water ports and reshaped trade dynamics. But Catherine's legacy was not limited to territorial expansion. She had a profound cultural influence as well. She played a key role in establishing the Hermitage Museum, amassed one of Europe's most significant art collections, and maintained correspondence with leading Enlightenment thinkers. Her court became a hub of sophistication, arts, and intellectual ambition. In a country often seen as backward by the West, she positioned Russia as a cultural force. She modernized education, founded girls' schools, and promoted the printing of books. She also introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself, an act of scientific courage for the time. However, her reign was full of contradictions. While she embraced Enlightenment values, she never emancipated the serfs. In fact, she expanded serfdom into new regions. Her reforms, though significant, were mostly imposed from the top down, enhancing the empire without fundamentally altering its structures. Nevertheless, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not simply inherited but had to be crafted, maintained, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but through will, political acumen, and strategic foresight. She was labelled many things: manipulative, tyrannical, reformist, seductive, but above all, she was effective. When she passed away in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more powerful than it had been in centuries. She left a stable throne, a vast empire, and a lasting legacy. Catherine didn't just reign, she ruled with intellect, strategy, and a firm grasp on history. In doing so, she became more than just an empress, she became a legend. Despite her immense power and accomplishments, Catherine remained aware of her precarious position. She was not born Russian and ascended the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that did not want a woman in charge, yet she not only survived but thrived. Catherine was never content to be a passive figurehead. She was a voracious reader, a prolific writer, and a continuous learner. Her days were filled with reading reports, communicating with foreign powers, editing state documents, and managing a court filled with rival factions. She wasn't merely a figurehead, she worked as though born to the throne. Still, in many ways, Catherine was a lonely figure. Though surrounded by courtiers, lovers, and artists, she often wrote of how few people she could truly trust. Her son Paul, whom she kept away from state affairs, eventually grew into a man she feared would undo all her work. Her most significant emotional connection with Gregory Potemkin evolved into a deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Catherine carefully crafted her image. She understood the power of narrative and shaped her identity as the mother of Russia, an enlightened monarch, a warrior, an empress, and a lover of the arts. Yet beneath these roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and kept moving forward. When she died in 1796, her empire was transformed, but questions remained. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by political necessity? Was she more a reformer or a ruler? History remembers her not for her virtues, but for the title she never claimed for herself: the Great. She earned this not because she was perfect, kind, or just, but because she took power and wielded it on her terms in a time and place where women were expected to have none. She didn't just wear the crown, she rewrote the very concept of deserving one. Ancient Maya whispers echo at Palenque, where great temples pierced the jungle canopy, their weathered limestone surfaces hinting at long-buried tales. In 1994, one such secret emerged. A group of Mexican archaeologists led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez examined Temple 3, a modest pyramid beside the renowned Temple of the Inscriptions, the tomb of the mighty King Pakal the Great. Initially, they expected little, until they discovered an untouched sealed chamber beneath the structure. Pristine, unplundered, it beckoned them inside. There, in the hush of centuries, lay a stone sarcophagus. When they lifted its lid, a brilliant red dust, crimson as smoke, billowed upward. The sarcophagus's interior was coated in powdered cinnabar, a ceremonial mercury sulfide. Within that scarlet haze rested the skeleton of a woman, carefully laid to rest. Her fragile bones remained intact, her skull adorned with a jade mask, and her body encircled by offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear-spools, crafted from jade and shell. Every detail spoke of royalty, yet no inscription named her. No glyph revealed her identity. It was among the richest female burials discovered in Mesoamerica, and yet she was a complete mystery. Why the red powder? Who was she? A queen? A priestess? Perhaps Pakal's consort? The researchers dubbed her the Red Queen, a name that endured. Even with modern forensic techniques, her identity remains elusive, only that she lived during Palenque's 7th century heyday. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers was hidden, untouched, deliberately isolated. Her interment transcended ceremony. It was a spiritual rite. She wasn't meant to be memorialized by words, but through ritual, color, and the enigma she embodied. The most haunting aspect wasn't her jade treasure or the sealed stillness, but that layer of cinnabar clinging like blood to stone, bone, and offerings alike. To the Maya, cinnabar, crushed mercury sulfide, was both sacred and perilous. Its vivid red symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force binding mortal and divine. It was the color of sunrise, sacrifice, and emergence from death. More than symbolic, it was deeply spiritual. Coating the dead in cinnabar was a rite of passage, preparing the body not for endless preservation, but for transition to another cosmic realm. Thus the Red Queen was readied not merely for burial, but for deification. Yet cinnabar's toxicity, its potential to poison, underscored its power. Its use declared the deceased as more than mortal. At Palenque, few were so honored. Pakal himself received the same treatment. This shared feature fueled speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, mother, or an equal in divine stature? Her skull rested on jaguar skin, another emblem of sanctity, surrounded by bone needles, obsidian blades, and tiny jade figurines, tokens of rituals performed in life or death. Each element narrated a wordless story of cloaked authority. A woman poised to journey into the underworld not in silence, but in ceremony, awash in the hue of sacrifice. Around her lay a world hushed except for the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian, offerings chosen to guide her through Xibalba, the Maya afterlife. At her sides lay heavy jade necklaces, their polished surfaces undimmed by centuries underground. Jade, symbol of eternal life, of mazes' green promise, jungle vitality, and divine breath, was reserved for the elite. On the Red Queen, it adorned chest, wrists, and ears, a clear testament to her influence, perhaps even divine favor. Among the most poignant treasures was the mosaic jade mask over her face. Unlike Egypt's golden funerary masks, this one, assembled from countless tiny tiles, echoed her skull's contours. It served to protect her soul, preserve her identity, and present her as divine before the gods. The burial contained bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts which could have been ceremonial tools or symbols of her role as a priestess, healer, or royal figure. One bone pin, engraved subtly but with intent, seemed like a faint trace of her voice lost to time. At her feet and along the tomb's edges were sealed ceramic vessels, likely once filled with offerings, food, drink, or incense, to nourish her spirit in the afterlife. The Maya believed the afterlife was a perilous, layered journey full of challenges. These items weren't luxuries, but essentials. When viewed through a modern lens, the tomb feels intimate and thoughtfully arranged, not excessive, with no gold chariots or grand displays, just items chosen with spiritual significance. It was a guide for the soul. Through these artifacts, we catch a glimpse of the Maya's view of death, not as an end, but as a shift of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared for ascension. Despite the grandeur of her tomb, one haunting detail stands out. Her name is missing, and no inscriptions or glyphs identified her. She was clearly someone of great power, but who exactly? Scholars have long speculated, and the most plausible theory is that she was Zakbu-A, the wife of Kinich Janab Pal, known as Pal the Great, the most renowned ruler of Palank. Zakbu-Aha was more than just his wife. Born into nobility, she married into Palank's royal line at a young age, bore at least 3 sons who held high status, and played a central ceremonial role during her husband's reign. Her status makes her a strong candidate for such an honorable burial. Evidence supporting this theory includes the tomb's location, just a few feet from Pal's own elaborate burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions, suggesting a deliberate pairing of the two in death. The presence of cinnabar, which covers only 2 burials in Palank, Pal's and the Red Queen's, also suggests this is not mere coincidence. However, DNA tests on both sets of remains yielded inconclusive results. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pal, but this doesn't rule out a spousal connection, as marriage doesn't require shared bloodlines. Some have proposed she could have been Sakuk, Pal's powerful mother, who ruled Palank before his maturity, or a high priestess, sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost over time. Yet the evidence most strongly points to Taku-Ao, a queen, mother of kings, and spiritual counterpart to Pal. The lack of a name on her tomb may not have been an oversight, but a deliberate choice. In Maya cosmology, the soul's existence was not marked by monuments, but by rituals, symbols, and the whispers of the earth. Thus the Red Queen remains suspended between myth and reality. Her rule remembered not in stone, but in silence and scarlet. To understand her, we must consider the world she came from, where royal women, especially in Maya civilization, wielded more power than many realize. Politics in the Maya world was often a family affair, and royal women were not just passive figures. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers, conducting rituals, sponsoring temples, and ensuring dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital used to forge alliances and solidify claims to the throne. Take Sakuk, for instance, Pal the Great's mother. When Palanke's throne was vacant, she ruled as queen regent until Pal came of age, not as a placeholder, but as a powerful ruler issuing decrees and overseeing construction. Without her, Pal might never have risen to power. She wasn't an outlier. Across the Maya world, royal women in places like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul were depicted performing major ceremonies, engaging in diplomacy and warfare, or even ruling outright. In art, they were often shown in elaborate regalia, standing alongside kings as equals or sometimes above them. Their words were inscribed in glyphs, and their names were remembered until time erased them. By the time the Spanish arrived, much of this history had been obscured, and colonial views cast indigenous women as silent figures in a male-dominated world. But the archaeological record tells a different story, one of complex gender roles where power was negotiated rather than inherited. This context sheds new light on the Red Queen. While she may not have held the title of ruler, Her burial, rich and sacred, placed next to Pal, suggests she was a key figure in the royal order. Her jade mask was not just ornamental, but a symbol of her power both in life and death. Her bloodline may have been the very foundation that upheld Palanca's dynasty. In Maya society, queens weren't just symbolic. They were keepers of sacred lineage, crucial participants in ceremonies, and often the link between the divine and the mortal. The Red Queen's lack of a name doesn't mean she was voiceless. On the contrary, her influence is felt through the silence and the scarlet. She was interred in a structure filled with significance, layered with Maya cosmology, symbolism, and deliberate design. Her tomb wasn't just a burial, it was a portal to eternity. Her remains were found in Temple 3, one of the smaller pyramids at the heart of the city. The proximity to the monumental tomb of the great ruler is notable. These temples were strategically placed, their locations sacred, and determined by astrology, mythology, and dynastic heritage. Temple 3, though modest in comparison to its grand neighbor, conceals something even more profound. A sealed crypt, untouched and perfectly preserved for over a millennium. Built deep within the temple's core, it was accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into the tomb is symbolic, a journey into the underworld. The chamber itself is bare, made of hewn stone, sealed for over 1,100 years. No murals or carvings adorn its walls. The silence may be intentional, a space meant for the dead, not the living, to interpret. In the center rests her sarcophagus, a limestone altar, echoing the grand stone coffin of the great ruler next door. While his tomb features scenes of cosmic renewal, hers focuses on the rituals of death. Yet the tomb's architecture subtly hints at deeper meaning. It is aligned east to west, reflecting the sun's cycle from life to death. The small yet powerful chamber feels like a personal, sacred space for someone highly revered. Maya temples were seen as tools connecting the heavens, earth, and underworld, and being buried within one elevated the deceased beyond human existence. The queen's final resting place was not a mere afterthought, but a carefully constructed sanctuary where death symbolized transformation. Her bones lie in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy is embedded in the temple's architecture, which speaks of her importance. For the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end, but a passage to the underworld, a sacred journey called Xibalba. For the Red Queen, this journey was not only spiritual, but also political, cosmological, and ritualistic. Burial rites were meticulously performed, deeply rooted in myth, guiding the soul through the underworld trials. Maya texts describe Xibalba as a dark realm full of challenges and death gods. Only those properly prepared could navigate it. The queen's tomb, with its cinnabar-wrapped body, stone encasement, and surrounding offerings, indicates her elite status. Additionally, bone needles and obsidian blades suggest auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic of actions she performed in life or rites performed at her burial to empower her spirit. The jade mask found with her was not just ornamental, it may have served to preserve her identity for her journey into the afterlife. According to Maya belief, the face mirrored the soul, which needed to be recognized by the gods. Surrounding ceramic vessels likely held provisions like chocolate, maize, water, or pulque for her journey. Items like stingray spines or shell trumpets could have been spiritual tools, symbols of communication with the gods. For the Maya, death was not an end, but a transformation, with the afterlife representing rebirth. Kings and queens were considered earthly gods, and in death they returned to their divine origins. The queen, buried in blood-coloured cinnabar, entombed within a pyramid, and honoured with offerings, was prepared for a rebirth not as a mortal, but as a divine figure in the cosmic order. Her burial marked not the end of her story, but the beginning of her legend. Nearby lies the famous tomb of Kinich Janab Pal, a grand burial known for its artistry and symbolism. But what makes the Queen's tomb so remarkable isn't only its contents, but its location. Her sarcophagus, hidden in Temple 3, sits next to Pal's monument. In a city where every temple's placement was cosmically significant, their proximity was no accident. It was a deliberate, symbolic gesture. Many believe the Red Queen was Pal's queen and trusted consort. Though her tomb lacks inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking, both wrapped in cinnabar, both placed in pyramids, both buried with jade, and both treated with the utmost reverence. The rituals of their burials mirror each other, as if they are two halves of a sacred narrative: death and rebirth. The simpler tomb of the Red Queen lacks such symbols, but the meaning is found in the pairing itself. If Pal symbolized the sun, journeying through the underworld at night, only to rise again, then the Red Queen might have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious course across the sky. Together they embodied a cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya beliefs, rulership was relational, not singular. Cosmic harmony depended on balance, which extended into the dynastic court, nastic. By positioning the Red Queen alongside Pal, the Maya preserved not just a marriage, but a cosmic partnership. Their closeness in death likely reflected their roles in life, a queen not behind, but beside her king, sharing not only a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs they communicate without words. Two souls intertwined in cinnabar and stone, united across eternity. One of history's most profound silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palanque remains not a forgotten artifact, but one of the most enigmatic and influential women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, continues to whisper across time, raising questions that grow louder with each new discovery. She represents a mystery that resists complete understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyphs bore her name. No thief told her story. Yet the care taken in her burial, the richness of her offerings, and the symbolism of her crimson-covered remains all point to a woman of great importance, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual depth, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to rethink our assumptions. She reminds us that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pal have long dominated historical attention, the Red Queen's re-emergence underscores that power was not confined to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is not just in the treasures left behind, but in the conversation she has sparked among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural detail in the temple speaks to intentionality. This woman mattered. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of her story is not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history is not just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle, a shared human desire to connect with the past. In this way, her legacy continues to unfold, wrapped in red, the color of life, sacrifice, blood, and rebirth. Her face, once concealed behind a jade mask, now gazes at us through science, art, and wonder. Though her name remains unknown, she is not voiceless, mysterious but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she reigns over something even greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story written in silence, yet somehow she still speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the lively district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, was filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilde Calderón, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites, Guillermo reserved and intellectual, Matilde religious and emotionally distant. Frida inherited her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions that most adults didn't want to answer. At the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. She tried to mask the physical difference with long skirts, but refused to let it limit her spirit. The illness kept her bedridden for months and isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and keep her mind sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or homemaker. She wanted to be a doctor, and at the age of 15, she enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of the few girls accepted. There, she stood out not only for her intelligence, but also for her rebellious wit, radical ideas, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution and ideas that challenged tradition. Even before the bus crash that would define her body and the fame that would shape her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too large to fit anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán, she was preparing to completely reinvent herself. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was irrevocably changed. The girl she had been was no more, That afternoon, she and her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arras, boarded a wooden bus after school, teasing, and likely arguing. Frida had never done anything halfway. Moments later, the bus crashed into a streetcar, and her future unraveled in an instant, filled with pain, metal, and silence. The impact was devastating. The streetcar smashed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and sending passengers flying. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail that pierced through her left hip and exited her pelvis. Her spine fractured in 3 places, her right leg shattered, her foot dislocated, her collarbone and ribs broken, her shoulder dislocated, and her abdomen punctured. She was just 18 years old. Someone covered her with an overcoat, while another person noticed her body glimmering, not with blood, but from the gold powder in her pouch, which had exploded upon impact, covering her in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was rushed to the Red Cross hospital and underwent multiple surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, fighting infections and uncertainty. The future she once envisioned of becoming a doctor faded with each passing day. Yet, amid the stillness, something began to emerge. Her father brought her brushes, and her mother created a special easel for her to use while lying in bed. A mirror was placed above her so she could see herself, and in her agony, Frida began to paint. What started as a means to pass the time evolved into an obsession. Her first subjects were self-portraits because she was all she had, but what emerged was not vanity, it was survival. The crash had broken her body, but it also opened a door to a new way of understanding herself, her pain, and her identity. She began to heal herself, one brushstroke at a time. As she lay in a body cast, a body struggling with every breath, Frida began to paint. What began as therapy became a form of communication, a deeply personal, brutally honest language. She didn't paint beautiful flowers or peaceful landscapes. She painted her own pain, physical, emotional, and existential. Her first works were self-portraits, not out of vanity, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her early pieces were small, painted on tin or wood, inspired by Mexican ritos, devotional paintings depicting suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward, using her body as the canvas and her emotions as the altar. She painted herself pierced, bleeding and broken. In one piece, she is impaled by nails like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a desolate landscape, chained to a broken column symbolizing her shattered spine. She depicted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated and vulnerable, yet never passive, always observant. Her pain was unfiltered, painted with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece reclaimed her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her own story, she was creating a new kind of narrative. Her paintings fused Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism into dreamlike autopsies of her soul. By the time she was able to walk again, though painfully, Frida was no longer the young girl who wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist with a unique style no one had seen before. She had transformed the worst event of her life into a source of creativity. Frida didn't merely paint her suffering, she made the world confront it, turning pain into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and at just 21 years old, Frida met Diego Rivera, the man who would become both her greatest love and greatest challenge. He was 20 years older than her and already Mexico's most renowned painter. A giant in both stature and reputation, Rivera was a master of Mexican muralism, known for his large, politically charged frescoes that chronicled the story of the Mexican people. Frida had admired his work before, but now she sought his opinion on her own. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego glanced at her work and replied, "Yes, and not just out of kindness." He saw something rare in her, a raw, unfiltered voice full of pain, beauty, and defiance. Their relationship began soon after, as much a creative collaboration as a passionate romance. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life. One was when a streetcar knocked me down, the other was Diego." They married in 1929, an unlikely pairing in the eyes of many. Diego, massive, unfaithful, and already a towering figure in the art world, became Frida's most profound and tumultuous relationship. Frida was politically prominent, known for her sharp tongue and fierce independence, even as she began walking with a cane. Her parents described her marriage as one between an elephant and a dove, passionate yet tumultuous. Diego supported her artistic development, but his constant infidelities, including with Frida's sister Christina, devastated her. In response, she had affairs with both men and women, including rumoured liaisons with Leon Trotsky and artist Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939 but remarried the following year with new terms. Frida would retain her independence, her home, her wealth, and her name. Their second marriage centered less on traditional love and more on mutual creative and intellectual respect. Despite the betrayals, Diego remained a pivotal figure in Frida's life, pushing her forward as both an artist and a revolutionary. Together, they were a legendary, though chaotic, pair. In the 1930s, Frida accompanied Diego on his travels to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York, where he worked on large-scale mural commissions. These experiences exposed her to American industrialism and capitalism, deepening her political disillusionment. As a proud Mexican nationalist, communist, and admirer of indigenous cultures, she found the American wealth and materialism, particularly during the Great Depression, disturbing. She criticized the culture's superficiality and longed for the authenticity of Mexico. While Diego worked on murals, Frida focused on smaller, deeply personal paintings, often on tin or canvas. Her artistic style became more defined, surreal, emotional, and intimate. And it was during this period that she created some of her most iconic self-portraits. These were not acts of vanity but survival. She painted her identity and inner pain, often depicting her fragmented and bleeding body with calm, unapologetic expressions. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her in a hospital bed surrounded by symbols of loss, reflecting her personal trauma and heartbreak. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home during his exile. Frida wore traditional indigenous clothing not just as a fashion statement, but as a political and cultural act. Her art was deeply intertwined with her beliefs and identity, reflecting both her ideological convictions and the personal cost of revolution. While Diego's murals depicted the larger picture of revolution, Frida focused on its human aspects, the pain, the struggle, and the resilience of the self. By the late 1930s, Frida had transformed into an artist in her own right. She was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife, but an independent force whose work was marked by raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Her home, Casa Azul in Coyoacan, became a vibrant extension of her imagination, filled with pre-Columbian artifacts, folk art, and revolutionary literature. This period saw an explosion of creativity in her work, with pieces like The Two Fridas, which portrayed the internal conflict between her European and indigenous identities. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso and Kandinsky recognized her unique style. However, Frida resisted being labeled a surrealist by André Breton, explaining that she painted not dreams, but her reality. Her art captured Mexico, not the romanticized version, but its raw, lived reality. With symbols like skeletons, hummingbirds, and blood, she celebrated the indigenous heritage of her country while exposing its history of violence. Despite enduring severe health issues, including multiple surgeries and chronic pain, Frida continued to paint, using her art to reclaim power and express her truth. As the 1940s progressed, her health worsened, but her spirit and creative drive remained unyielding. She betrayed her own body. Her spine weakened, her right leg perpetually infected. Over her lifetime, she endured more than 30 surgeries, often back to back. There were months when she was bedridden, bound in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. Yet she continued to paint. Each canvas became both a release and an act of defiance. Her works grew darker and more resolute, painted with a clarity that came from pain, refusing to hide behind symbolism. In the broken column, she depicted herself split in two, her body pierced by nails, a fractured ionic column in place of her spine. But her expression remained stoic, her gaze unwavering. For her, pain was no longer just a subject. It was her constant companion, her adversary, her muse. Her political activism also intensified. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, participated in protests, wrote impassioned letters, and denounced imperialism and injustice. When her health prevented her from walking, she attended rallies in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, she had her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long-awaited recognition of her art. But her health was so fragile that doctors advised against her attending. True to form, she arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional clothing, surrounded by her own paintings, she welcomed guests with tequila, laughter, and that unmistakable fire in her eyes. Her final works were both childlike and poignant. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she portrayed herself in a steel corset, cradled by Marx's hands, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known piece was a still life of sliced watermelons, one of which bore the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even as death loomed, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits were not merely self-portraits, but acts of revolution, painted in agony but always signed with life. On July 13th, 1954, at 47, she died in the same place where she was born, La Casa Azul, in Coyoacán. The official cause was a pulmonary embolism, but those close to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also worn out from constant pain, surgeries, and her prolonged battle with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala, frail and in a wheelchair, yet her fist was raised in defiance. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was short but profound. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's premier cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera, devastated, called her the greatest love of his life, even though his betrayals had nearly shattered her. In the years after her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to fade into obscurity. Initially, her name was known only in artistic circles. Her work didn't easily fit into any category, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But over time, her image, her story, and her resistance began to resonate. In the 1970s and 80s, as feminist scholars and activists resurrected forgotten voices, Frida's grew louder. She became more than a painter. She symbolized pain transformed into beauty, feminism forged through resistance, unapologetic Mexican identity, queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her unibrow, her intense gaze, and the flowers in her hair became iconic. Her home became a museum, her diary a sacred text, and her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. For much of her life, Frida lived in Diego's shadow, but in death she stepped into the light. She didn't leave behind just paintings. She left a mirror, daring us all to look, us all not with pity or fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere, on t-shirts, murals, dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature unibrow, flower-crowned hair, and direct gaze are instantly recognizable. What makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face, but that they understand the truth behind it. Frida didn't strive for perfection. She didn't conform. She refused to be conventional, and she didn't care to be. In a world that demands flawlessness, she gave us raw, unfiltered realness, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different, her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and transformed it into art that transcended borders and decades. She became more than an artist. She became a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't need permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel creativity, not stop it. For Mexico, she's a fierce daughter, folkloric and inseparable from the nation's soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or personal, are now among the most cherished in the world. In the world, works like the self-portrait with a thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column are more than just visual art. They resonate deeply with anyone who has experienced pain and sought to transform that suffering into something sacred. She lived on the fringes, yet made them her stage. She embraced contradictions, a communist adorned in gold, a woman who had been betrayed but still capable of love, a body shattered but a spirit unyielding. Through it all, she painted, not just with colour, but with purpose. She never sought to be a symbol, she simply told her truth. In doing so, she gave voice to millions who had never seen themselves represented in art. Now, when we see her image, we see courage, colour, resistance. Frida, not gone, but eternal.